The importance of space to the modern economy is taken for granted. We rely on satellite telecommunications to link all corners of the world. Earth observation satellites deliver accurate weather information and can monitor subtle changes in the Earth's environment. Our knowledge of neighboring planets has benefited immeasurably from solar system probes, and space-based telescopes are answering fundamental questions about the universe. However, there was a time when the development of nuclear strike weapons had priority over space exploration, regarded as a curiosity of little value. The Great War was over. In Paris, workers dismantled the shroud protecting the Triomphe de la République. Gradually, life was returning to normal. American troops were preparing to go home, and peace talks had begun. In May 1919, a German delegation was presented with conditions they had no part in drafting. When faced with the war guilt clause, the German foreign minister said, "We feel your hatred," and the delegation withdrew. Pomp and ceremony surrounded the formal ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, with Germany only agreeing to sign when threatened with a resumption of hostilities. Germany lost territory and 7 million citizens, with many others forced to relocate. Severe limits upon its military capacity were imposed, including restrictions on the development of artillery. In the early 1930s, the German army became interested in the Spaceflight Society, a small club working with rockets, a technology not mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles. The group was given funding from the army, and they kept an eye on young Wernher von Braun. At 13, von Braun had been captivated by the book By Rocket to Planetary Space. He had joined the Spaceflight Society when he was 18. He showed promise in physics and mathematics, and his name would be associated with rocketry for more than 4 decades. Soon after the rise to power of the Nazi Party, the new Chancellor Adolf Hitler began a rearmament program, effectively renouncing the Treaty of Versailles and preparing for war. This meant an increased budget for the military, who funded research for von Braun's doctoral thesis, with the promising young man ultimately being absorbed into the Armed Forces research program. The young von Braun claimed he was uninterested in politics, yet his conservative Prussian background allowed him to fit easily into the military structures surrounding him. He had charm, and he could be very persuasive. His thesis became a state secret. He was provided with an army facility at Kummersdorf near Berlin. His group began to perfect a rocket motor that used liquid propellants. While the group were not the first to experiment with liquid fuel, they were the first to deliver the fuel under pressure via a turbo pump, a technique that remains in use to this day. The Luftwaffe noticed and requested work for rocket assistance in fighter aircraft. In 1936, a Heinkel 112 was made available to von Braun for modification. Though testing proved that the concept was feasible, the rocket-assisted fighter did not see active service. At Kummersdorf, work commenced on the Aggregat series of rockets designed by von Braun and under the leadership of artillery officer Major Walter Domberger. In 1934, von Braun had been made an employee. At the age of 24, he was in charge of a team of technicians and craftsmen. As the work continued, they had to explore new areas of technology, particularly regarding guidance and the use of gyroscopes. When von Braun demonstrated the long-range capacity of the prototype A3 rocket, the research was given extra funding, and a vast new facility was constructed at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. A satellite town was built to house the army of technical experts and workers now employed in the German rocket program. The Peenemünde Army Research Center would grow to be comparable with the United States Manhattan Project. Von Braun, still in his 20s, was made its technical director. He had been firmly asked to join the SS. Knowing a refusal would end his career, he accepted. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, forcing Britain and France to declare war. The Nazi government gave the work at Peenemünde added priority. Development at Peenemünde was decades ahead of any rocket research taking place in the Allied nations. Flight testing of the A4 began in 1942. While the full-sized missile potentially had the power and the range to make it a formidable weapon, reliability and guidance still presented major problems. During powered flight, the A4 was controlled via graphite vanes in the exhaust stream. After the engine cut out, rudders on the tail fins took over. In early testing, the fins, which were needed for directional stability, made the rocket turn into the wind. In October 1943, the A4 successfully demonstrated the range and accuracy its designers had been promising. Plans to mass-produce the rocket began taking shape. Design stipulations said the A4 should have a range of at least 275 kilometers, it should carry a 1-ton warhead, and it should be easily transported by road or rail. Propellants were ethanol diluted with 25% water and liquid oxygen. The fuel and oxidizer were forced into the engine via a turbopump driven by superheated steam generated by hydrogen peroxide with a calcium permanganate catalyst. The Allies were aware of a German aerial torpedo from secretly recorded conversations between senior German officers in a British prisoner of war camp. In August 1943, a British air raid struck the facility at Peenemünde. Mass production of the A4 was transferred to an underground assembly plant in the Harz Mountains. Conditions were abysmal, and slave labor was used to produce the missiles, with more people building the rockets dying than were claimed by the missile as a weapon of war. Before these wonder weapons were ready for deployment, the Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. And in France, the Allied invasion had gained a foothold in Normandy. Germany was under attack from both the east and the west. With the Luftwaffe severely depleted, the country's leaders were counting on the new technologies to restore their dominance. Before the A4 was operational, another weapon, the flying bomb, was launched against London. It too had been developed at Peenemünde. After a while, the British developed techniques to shoot it down. And though it was not accurate enough to hit specific military targets, its attacks tied up defense personnel and took a heavy civilian toll. When the A4 was finally ready to be deployed, the rockets and their support equipment were transported to various sites along the French coast. They were loaded onto mobile launchers, enabling them to be fired from any flat area within target range. Attacks were launched against London in September 1944 and Antwerp soon after. They also took a toll on civilian lives, but were even less accurate than the flying bomb. In response to mockery in the British press, Reichsminister for Propaganda Joseph Goebbels referred to the new series of weapons as Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons. Thus the V1 and the V2 got their names. While the V2 was inaccurate, having negligible effect on the war, there was absolutely no defense against it, and military planners took notice. In Western Europe, retreating German forces left devastation in their wake. V2 launch sites along the French coast were captured, and experts tried to learn what they could from the wreckage. Launch teams had retreated, but agents had a list of engineers they wanted to interrogate. In 1945, Germany was invaded, and intelligence specialists in both the American and Russian forces were alerted to look for German rockets. As Russian forces advanced from the east, it was clear that Germany's fate was sealed. With Soviet troops nearing Peenemünde, Wernher von Braun and his team loaded V2 documentation into trucks and fled to the south, preferring to be captured by the American military. In the town of Reuter in Austria, the rocket engineers surrendered to the Americans. Wernher von Braun, the brains behind the V2, along with 14 tons of drawings and specifications, was now in American hands. Around 100 V2s, along with spare components, were recovered from the Mittelbau assembly plant. They were shipped to the United States. Rocket science was about to make an even more frightening development. The Second World War ended with the United States as the undisputed superpower. It had a monopoly on atomic weaponry, and it was incredibly wealthy. However, US-Soviet relations, that had reached a high point when their armies had met at the Elbe River in Germany, had soured. With a giant battle-hardened army, Joseph Stalin was determined to spread Soviet influence. His country had lost 25 million people during the war, and he wanted a share of the spoils. An intense rivalry developed between the two nations, which quickly became known as the Cold War. At that time, the world was coming to terms with the Nazi atrocities committed during the war, and those implicated in genocide were to be punished. However, German rocket specialists were gradually being brought to the United States to contribute to the next generation of missiles. The US Army asked few questions about Nazi or SS affiliations. Preliminary contracts were offered to German rocket specialists, and more than 100 accepted, including von Braun. General Electric technicians, under the guidance of Wernher von Braun, began assembling the captured German parts. Soon, the company began building copies of the technology. On April 16, 1946, Test flights began at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The first flight carried test equipment inside a heavily armored canister. Though the rocket launched correctly, it broke apart in flight. More successful flights followed, but scientific equipment that the team hoped to recover was still returning smashed to pieces. When that problem was solved, cameras and radiation detectors were loaded into the rocket. While the driving force behind the tests was to learn about the rocket technology, it was realized that a lot of scientific questions about the upper atmosphere could also be answered. These pictures, from a high point of 105 kilometers, were the first real images of the Earth from space. Yet the military minds, so keen to develop rocketry, were focused upon the technology as a new, long-distance form of artillery. Fitting a missile with an atomic warhead was also an interesting prospect. Travel to space was not regarded as having any great utility. One of the more bizarre tests was known as Operation Sandy. A V-2 launch was attempted from the deck of the carrier Midway. A special rig held the rocket steady till just before liftoff. The United States Navy was also eager to understand how missiles could increase their reach. The rocket broke up at close to 5,000 meters, and the Navy decided to develop its own missile. The Soviet Union had scavenged some V-2 parts after the war, and they were also keen to master the V-2 technology. In 1947, at Kasputin Yar near Stalingrad, the Russians quietly launched their first German rocket. As American forces in Europe were demobilized, an imbalance between Eastern and Western armies developed, but the American monopoly on atomic weapons gave the US a sense of security. Late in 1949, the Soviet Union secretly detonated an atomic weapon at Semipalatinsk in far eastern Kazakhstan. It did not remain secret for long. A B-29 weather reconnaissance aircraft collected radioactive particles on a flight from Japan to Alaska. It was a surprise to the Americans, who expected the Russians to take much longer to develop an atomic weapon. And it was a surprise to the Russians, as they had hoped to continue in secrecy. This was a major intensification in the Cold War, and missile development in both the United States and the Soviet Union intensified. A number of different American organizations were working in different areas. The German scientists continued their collaboration with the Army and General Electric, using their stock of war surplus V-2s. The Navy was developing the Viking missile. It was the first to have attitude control via a gimbaling engine bell. And a unique group of Caltech graduates had started working on rockets in the 1930s. Their jet-assisted takeoff technology allowed heavily laden bombers to fly from very short landing strips. Known as the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they were part of the Californian Institute of Technology, the only American rocket research laboratory connected to a university. After the war, they began working on missiles. The liquid-fueled Corporal was designed for scientific payloads. It reached heights of 72 kilometers. The bumper program used a Corporal rocket mounted atop a V2 to become the first proper two-stage launch combination. The German team were only marginally involved in fitting one rocket onto the other, and though the bumper program met with limited success, its last two flights were the first launches from the new Cape Canaveral launch site. These launches helped the military teams to further develop tracking and in-flight communications with the rocket. In 1953, the Eisenhower administration took office as the Cold War continued to deepen. A military man, Eisenhower understood the financial benefits that flowed to industry via lucrative defense contracts. And while he was keen to rein in the vast sums spent on weaponry, he was under pressure from the anti-communist lobby. Later that year, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died, and a power struggle followed. One faction wanted to spend less on arms to increase the standard of living. The other side did not want the country to be perceived as weak. Attempting to seize the moment, President Eisenhower proposed curtailing the growing nuclear arms race, railing against the high level of spending on arms. In the US, short-range missiles with atomic warheads emerged. This was a way to maintain a first strike advantage over the Soviet Union. While the United States realized it had underestimated the Soviet Union's progress with atomic weaponry, the country continued to dismiss any ideas about Russia's ability to develop missiles. In reality, the Russians had followed a similar path to the Americans. They had learned all they could from the V2 and then began to copy it. They were also keen to unite an atomic warhead with a long-range missile. There were no plans to launch a satellite. In the United States, all rocket development was firmly under the control of the military. The Air Force, which had previously been a branch of the Army, had been spun off as an independent service. The Navy, the Army, and the Air Force were all working on missiles. In the Soviet Union, all rocket research was carried out by the Special Design Bureau No. 1, led by chief designer Sergei Korolev. From 1946, they concentrated on a long-range, heavy-lift rocket. Though they had limited resources, this focused approach was more efficient than the scattered development in the US. In 1952, the idea of space travel was thrust into the public realm by a series of articles published in Collier's magazine. The brilliant illustrations by Chesney Bonestell caught the eye, and they exposed the name of Wernher von Braun, one of the technical consultants. At the time, it was science fiction, but it marked the beginning of a public relations campaign by qualified space enthusiasts, and it saw von Braun become a presence on American television. By now, the German experts had been moved to a more comfortable work environment at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. The US Army established the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville with Wernher von Braun, now an American citizen, as technical director. They designed and built the Redstone missile, essentially an improved V2. It was intended to carry a thermonuclear warhead over a 350-kilometer range, and it was the United States' first large missile. The warhead weighed roughly 2 tons, but everybody at the agency knew that it could be fitted with 2 much lighter solid-fueled upper stages and deliver a satellite to orbit. Working in collaboration with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the upper stages and a research satellite had already been built. but the White House had expressly forbidden the Army from launching their satellite. The Eisenhower administration favored the Navy's Vanguard. It had been designed for purely scientific research, and the president felt a military missile designed by Germans might not be seen as a peaceful gesture. With the approach of the International Geophysical Year, scientists had put out a challenge for a satellite to be orbited, and President Eisenhower announced that America would meet the challenge. But Eisenhower worried that international law was unclear about the status of a satellite. Was it like an aircraft that could not stray into hostile airspace? Or was space akin to the oceans, where ships have rights of passage? Nobody paid much attention when the Soviet Union announced that it too would launch a satellite. In the early 1950s, both superpowers began testing more powerful hydrogen bombs, and the development of long-range missiles became more pressing. In the Soviet Union, the R-5 emerged, followed soon by a refined version known as the R-5M. Like the US Redstone, the R-5 drew heavily on the V-2. It used the same fuel and was controlled by vanes in the exhaust stream. It had a single stage. Developers were struggling with getting additional stages to ignite during flight. Crucially, it could be equipped with a detachable nuclear warhead. When US intelligence understood what Soviet missile designers had achieved, a defunct contract with aircraft builder Convair was revived. The Atlas missile went into rapid development, and it owed nothing to the German missile. Its propellants were liquid oxygen and highly refined kerosene known as RP-1. Like the Russians, the American engineers had not yet been able to ignite a rocket engine in flight. So the Atlas had a central sustainer engine flanked by two booster engines, which were all started on the ground. After 2 minutes of flight, the two outer engines were discarded, and the rocket continued flying with just the sustainer engine.
Status check, range safety arm light on.
Flight testing began in 1957.
Water system ready.
It had been built to carry a nuclear warhead over intercontinental distances, but its unconventional design led to teething problems. To save weight, the Atlas had a balloon structure. Its stainless steel propellant tanks formed the outer skin of the rocket, which could only maintain its strength under pressure. This Atlas B suffered from a turbopump failure. The Atlas's development was plagued by difficulty. At the same time in the Soviet Union, an equivalent rocket was being perfected. Like the Atlas, the R-7 owed nothing to the V-2. Its engines were of a radically new design, far ahead of anything the Americans had. By the standards of the day, the R-7 was huge. Chief designer Sergei Korolev had solved the problem of multiple stages in a similar way to the Atlas engineers. A core stage was flanked by 4 boosters that were all ignited on the ground. But unlike the Atlas, when the boosters had done their job, the engines and their fuel tanks were jettisoned. The R-7, known as the Semyorka, Russian for 7, was designed as an intercontinental nuclear missile. Its designers knew it could easily carry a satellite to orbit, and the new Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, also knew. And he intended to beat his capitalist rivals to space. In mid-1957, flight tests of the Semyorka commenced at a secret location in the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan. The first two flights failed spectacularly. Two successful flights followed in August and September. Work had not yet been completed on a large research satellite, so a simple silver ball containing a radio transmitter was hastily prepared. Khrushchev was in a hurry. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite. It was called Sputnik, and it went into a highly elliptical Earth orbit. Ham radio operators around the world could easily verify its presence as it passed overhead. Reaction in the United States was unexpected. Americans felt they were vulnerable to a Soviet attack.
I guess the American people are alarmed that a foreign country, especially an enemy country, can do this, and we fear this.
President Eisenhower came under immense pressure.
As far as the satellite itself is concerned, that doesn't raise my apprehensions, not one iota. The mere fact that this thing orbits involves no new discovery to science.
Eisenhower explained that they would continue with the plan to have the Vanguard rocket launch America's first satellite.
I consider our country's satellite program to be well designed and properly scheduled to achieve the scientific purposes for which it was initiated.
While the Vanguard team prepared their tiny satellite, the Soviet team was preparing a dog called Laika. She would ride to orbit in a satellite that contained life support equipment as well as radiation and solar monitors. Sputnik 2 was successfully launched in November 1957, and what was called the Sputnik crisis in the United States deepened. For the Soviet Union, demonstrating to the world that they had a technical superiority over the United States was important, something Nikita Khrushchev understood instinctively. Space became a new battleground in the Cold War. The following month, Americans watched their nation's response as Vanguard was finally set to launch. Its payload was a 1.5 kilogram satellite.
4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff.
It was a humiliation, with newspapers calling it Flopnik or Kaputnik. Finally, the Army team, led by von Braun, was given the opportunity to salvage American pride. A variant of the Redstone missile, known as the Juno 1, successfully launched Explorer 1 in January 1958. The space race had started, and much of its foundations had already been laid. There were celebrations that the United States was finally catching up with the Soviets. In Washington, after receiving confirmation that the satellite was in orbit, a late-night press conference was held. Bill Pickering from JPL, James Van Allen, who designed Explorer 1's radiation detector, and the now very familiar Wernher von Braun were the focus of attention. In 1958, the Eisenhower administration transformed the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics into a civilian space research organization, NASA. In 1960, NASA absorbed the US Army's Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, which became known as the Marshall Space Flight Center. For the first time in his life, Wernher von Braun was not working on weapons. As part of the transfer came a giant prototype that had commenced development in 1957. As yet, it had no clearly defined purpose other than to try to surpass the Russians' heavy lift capacity. Because the Soviet Union's much heavier nuclear devices needed larger launchers, they had an advantage in launching heavier payloads to orbit. Sputnik 1 weighed more than 83 kilograms, compared to Explorer 1, which was less than 14 kilograms. However, the Americans had an advantage with solid-state electronics, which allowed lighter payloads with lower power consumption. By 1959, the US's Atlas missile was ready as a counterbalance to the Russian Semyorka. But as weapons, both were outmoded from the beginning. Their liquid propellants meant they took longer to fuel than it took a bomber to reach the target. However, they both still had an important role to play. Because the Russians had launched a dog on their second orbital flight, it was obvious to NASA they were aiming at orbiting a manned spacecraft. In 1959, NASA recruited 7 test pilots as the first intake of astronauts. They were trained to fly with the newly established Mercury program. From the beginning, the Mercury 7 had rock star status. At the same time, the Soviet Union was recruiting cosmonauts, but it was a very top-secret affair. For America, the openness with which they conducted their civilian space program became a proud point of difference with the Soviets, who only announced successes after they had happened. But America had secrets too. A series of 38 research satellites, known as Discoverers, were launched between 1959 and 1962. The American public were told the Discoverers were testing orbital maneuvers and re-entry techniques, but they were really spy satellites, part of the Corona program. While this series made a number of space firsts, their top-secret nature made it impossible for America to herald their achievements. In Russia, the Experimental Design Bureau, known as OKB-1, were preparing a spacecraft. Because it would be launched on the Semyorka, the design was robust, with weight being a minor consideration. Known as Vostok, the launch weight of the craft was 4,750 kilograms, more than twice the weight of the first American capsule. The design was also used for Russia's first spy satellite. The Vostok spacecraft consisted of a spherical crew module and a conical service module. The only maneuvers available were rotational moves around its center of gravity. It used compressed nitrogen thrusters. This module would separate from the crew module 10 minutes after retrofire was completed. The service module contained batteries, most of the electronics, and the retrofire engine. After separation, the spherical crew module would passively align itself, with the heavier part of the capsule facing forward. Heat-dissipating ablative material covered the entire sphere. NASA was working on its Mercury capsule. The only American rocket capable of lifting this spacecraft to orbit was the Atlas. While it worked sometimes, this was not good enough for NASA, who didn't want an embarrassing launch failure to become a tragedy. It became clear that reliability issues with the Atlas would delay America's manned space program. An extensively modified version of the Atlas was needed for manned missions, and a separate production line with an emphasis on quality control was established to meet NASA's requirements. The Mercury spacecraft had to be light and therefore very compact, and designers turned to data gathered in the testing of warheads. The blunt body concept, formulated by aeronautical engineer Harry Allen, showed that a conical shape entering the atmosphere base first would allow most of the heat of re-entry to be carried away by the bow shock wave. It meant that only the blunt end of the capsule would have to be protected by ablative material. This became known as the heat shield, and it was a significant saving in weight. 3 retro rockets were positioned at the center of the heat shield and were jettisoned after retrofire. NASA still worried about booster explosions, so an escape tower that could pull the capsule clear in an emergency was attached above the spacecraft. It was jettisoned after the booster's engine had cut off. The Mercury spacecraft had a distinctive corrugated skin made of a nickel alloy that maintained its strength at high temperatures. Small attitude thrusters, powered by hydrogen peroxide, were used to control the capsule's pitch, yaw, and roll. The life support system provided the astronaut with pure oxygen at low pressure. The capsule had no computer, and all precise calculations for re-entry were made on the ground and radioed up to the craft. A series of test flights began in 1959, using an inexpensive Little Joe rocket. In the Space Corps of both the United States and the Soviet Union, rigorous training for the first manned spaceflight sometimes became bizarre. The focus upon extreme G-forces and the total absence of gravity were features of both the Soviet space program and NASA. While work on NASA's Mercury capsule progressed, development of the human-rated Atlas was much slower. The US Space Agency had anticipated this and planned preliminary flights using a variant of the Redstone missile.
We play the first part in this program in that we will provide some limited rides over ballistic trajectories of a few hundred miles range to these astronauts to give them a little inkling of what spaceflight is like.
The Redstone did not have the power to put the Mercury capsule into orbit, but it could still lift the spacecraft beyond the atmosphere. If NASA could fly an astronaut above 60 kilometers, even briefly, then America could claim the first man in space and salvage some national pride. Little information was released about Russian space activity until after there had been a success. Belka and Strelka were launched in August 1960. They sat inside a modified version of the cosmonaut ejection pod in the new Vostok spacecraft. After 17 orbits, they returned safely to the ground. The Russian space dogs became a media sensation, and NASA knew the Soviets were close to putting a man into space. Only those in OKB-1 knew that just 3 weeks earlier, 2 other dogs, Bars and Chaika, had been killed on impact after a booster explosion. In November 1960, NASA was preparing to launch its first Mercury-Redstone combination, MR-1. It was designed as an uncrewed mission that would test the booster, the Mercury spacecraft, and recovery procedures. Although NASA denied it was in a race with the Russians, everyone involved in the rival space programs understood the prestige that would follow should they be the first to put a man in space. If all went well with MR1, MR2 would carry a chimpanzee. NASA had opted for the Redstone because it had been flying successfully since 1953. But so many changes were required to enhance its reliability that it was, essentially, a new design. Its tanks had been extended to give it greater range. Its guidance system had been simplified. And an in-flight abort sensing system would automatically trigger the launch escape system if things went wrong. On the 21st of November, MR1 entered the final stages of its countdown. It was called the 4-inch flight. The engine cut out and the booster settled back on its pad. The only thing launched was the escape tower, followed by the parachute. While NASA officials said it had performed as intended, clearly the instructions were wrong. An astronaut would have been left isolated in the capsule, sitting on top of a fully fueled rocket. A new Redstone was delivered because the original had been damaged. The failure had affected morale at NASA, and their schedule had been put back. The same capsule was refurbished and mated for a second attempt called MR1B.
Ignition. Liftoff.
Launched in December 1960, the flight was successful. Life magazine broke the news that America's first astronaut would be either John Glenn, Gus Grissom, or Alan Shepard. The Mercury 7 knew Shepard would be the first, with Glenn as his backup, but the public would only find out on launch day. Shepard was not happy when he was told who would make the next flight. Ham, the chimpanzee, had been training for 3 weeks. Mission planners still feared that space could have strange effects on higher life forms and wanted to see how the flight affected a primate. Less than 2 weeks before Ham was due to become the first chimp in space, the torch was passed to a new generation of Americans. The Democrats were back in the White House, and NASA worried that the new President John Kennedy may not be sympathetic to the Mercury program. Alan Shepard was in training for his next flight, and so was Ham. By vigorously pressing a heavy lever multiple times, he would be rewarded with a banana pellet. If he reacted too slowly, he received an electric shock. He was launched on January the 31st, 1961. The flight did not go well. The Redstone's trajectory was too steep, and an overactive oxygen pump caused higher acceleration. Oxygen depletion saw the engine shut down early, triggering a high-altitude abort. Ham experienced 17 Gs, 3 more than had been predicted. Miraculously, Ham survived. Shepard still thought he could be the first man in space by launching on the next Redstone. But Wernher von Braun understood that the booster was not yet human-rated and insisted on another unmanned flight. On April the 12th, 1961, 27-year-old Senior Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin was preparing for the Soviet Union's first attempt at launching a man into space. He was to make a single orbit. The flight went according to plan. Gagarin returned safely to the Soviet Union, and his nation celebrated.
pressure.
3 weeks later, Alan Shepard made America's first manned flight into space, a hop from Florida into the central Atlantic. He too was treated as a national hero and was entertained at the White House. But Cold War space rivalry was not over. President Kennedy took advice from Wernher von Braun, and the space race had a new finish line: the moon.
Der Betrag, den unsere Geschwindigkeit zu klein war, ist daher sehr minimal.
Wernher von Braun, the man who came to America as the Nazi rocket scientist who had built the V2, was absorbed into the American military machine when it was inconvenient to examine past history. He became a loyal American and ultimately director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center.
We have been given the scientific knowledge, the technical ability.
As an advocate, he had firmly planted the idea of space travel in the minds of ordinary Americans, then designed the rockets that made it possible. His pioneering work opened up space for scientific and commercial applications. So many of his innovations are standard features in modern launch systems. Yet it was difficult for him to escape the past. Some saw him as a naive accomplice in the Nazi regime. Others felt he had a case to answer. His creation, the Saturn V, the rocket that took Apollo astronauts to the moon, never failed. He died shortly after the Apollo program finished.